welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And on today's episode, Josh and I are going to be discussing the different stages of a set. Not an entire match quite yet, because we'll get into some other situations with that. But we're going to talk about the different stages of a set and how a player can mentally prepare and handle those situations, maybe be a little bit more mentally tough in these different stages of a set. So hopefully we can successfully navigate all the way to the end. You know, when I think of, playing winning tennis, it's understanding how to get from 0 to 6 before your opponent. And that really, that's easier said than it is actually to do, right, Josh?
That's for sure.
So before we get into the different stages of the set that we're going to go through, let's talk about first, what are the common challenges, to navigating through a set? Talk about some of the things that you've seen in, your career as a sports psych professional and even as a player.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of players get nervous or get anxious at different points in a match, whether that be, just sort of those first few games in a match or in a set where they really feel those butterflies. Maybe that's something they've been feeling for the 20, 30 minutes before a match as well. But, early in a match, that can definitely happen, as well as, later in a match, closing out a set. And I know we'll talk more about that. But nervousness and anxiety are definitely a big one. What about you, Brian? What's one of the big challenges that you see?
Well, I think to, sort of extend what you said, I think the nerves and the anxiety are probably a result of we're focused on results.
Yep.
Obviously, that means we're focused on something we can't necessarily control. We also might be focused on what other people will think about us, probably because of results, whether that be winning or losing, right? And so the consequence, I think, on both is that now we've diverted some of our focus to something that we can't control. I think another aspect, and we'll get into this, when we're talking about being up a break and down a break, but this concept of loss aversion, where we tend to think a little bit more about what we have to lose than what we have to gain. And it's not obviously 100-0 in terms of the ratio, but it's enough that maybe we start to get a little bit more tentative and anxious. I think, we were discussing some things ahead of the episode, and one of the things that you brought up that I thought that was a really good common challenge is this loss of intensity at times. And that can also be due to the scoreboard.
Yep.
Because we might be thinking, I'm up 3-0, I'm up a break. Yeah, this is going to be easy. And then maybe not so much. Things can change.
Right. No, I see that. I see that all the time. I mean, a player gets off to a hot start. Maybe they're up 3-0 and, they're playing great. And then rather than sticking to what's been working, they take that foot off the gas. And then the next thing you know, the other player's broken back. It's 3-2, and it's a whole different match.
Yeah.
So I think reminding players when they're in that type of position to keep that intensity up, to keep that foot on the gas, and to sort of stick with what's working.
Yeah, and I think one aspect I'd like to talk about as we get into this is what are we really trying to do on this sort of journey 0 to 6? Where is our focus? And I really believe that our focus needs to be much more on breaking the opponent down than anything else. That focus has to be external to us. We both know that once self-criticism comes into play, then the focus goes back onto the individual player. If they start thinking about technique, then they start to lose trust in their abilities. Confidence goes down. And I think that's another aspect of, a common issue with, navigating your way through a set is a loss of confidence, a loss of trust in your abilities. And I would say a different flavor of confidence would be in self-belief.
Yep.
So, believing that you can win is a little bit different than trusting your shots. And I think this is where, optimism is a really important positive emotion that tennis players need to have. No matter what the score is, you have to feel like, your best tennis is still in front of you. You have to feel like you're still in it, as you're going through these things. So I think we want to make sure that when we touch on each of these situations that we're helping people understand that the focus needs to be external, and we're playing with purpose, and the purpose of that is really to break down your opponents. So what are your thoughts on that, Josh? Is that a philosophy that you use with players?
Yeah, definitely. Breaking down the opposing player, making life as difficult as possible for that player. I think it's also sort of a fine line, and can be challenging because you want to help players play their own game and utilize their own strengths. At the same time, focusing on the opposing opponent's weaknesses and trying to make life as difficult as possible for that opponent. So being able to use your strengths against their weaknesses.
Correct.
And as you said, at these different stages in a match, to sort of have that external focus on, okay, what's going on in this match right now? Who's doing what to who, rather than getting so focused internally on a particular shot that maybe isn't working, or the technique on that shot, or just the general frustrations that can come about in a match. So I definitely think that external focus and sort of a broad bird's eye view is really an important piece.
Yeah, and I think you just prompted a thought in my head, is that a frequent thing that I hear from players is, well, I wasn't playing well. And I hate to say it, but that's fairly normal.
Right.
You're not always going to play your best. In fact, you probably most of the time won't play your best. And that's not an excuse to abandon, that analysis part that you just talked about, of trying to figure out who's doing what to whom, and, how do I change this equation? When we get that type of self-criticism, or we're so worried about not playing well, it tends to turn off the analytical parts of our brain, and we're not able to actually see what's in front of us, and we usually just end up continuing to play the same way, which is a losing game, usually.
No, absolutely. And I think, Brad Gilbert, who, his book, Winning Ugly, is certainly one of the tenets of how I view the sport of tennis. He says, a few times a year, you're just going to be on fire. Nothing's going to stop you, and you're going to win. You probably won't need to utilize many of these mental skills because, everything's working for you. All the stars are aligned. And then maybe a few times a year, nothing's working for you. And, you can certainly try to utilize, mental skills, and it'll certainly give you a better chance. But, maybe on those few times a year, it might just not be your day. But the rest of the time, maybe that's 90% of the time that's remaining, you've got a chance. You're in it. And it's about figuring out the situation, whether your shots, whether your forehand or your backhand are, feeling quite as good as you'd want them to be. You've got to work with what you have on that particular day and figure out the situation and realize that, hey, maybe I don't need my absolute best stuff today to beat this person in front of me. I just need to be able to analyze the situation, recognize their strengths and weaknesses, and use my own strengths against their weaknesses in order to give myself the best possible chance.
And I think that's one reason why the idea of playing as many practice matches or competitive matches as you can is to me, that's really advisable. Because then you're putting yourself in those situations more and more often. You're gaining more experience. You understand how to handle them. You're, of course, going to fail at certain situations probably at first, but then you learn from that, and then you can make some adjustments and go forth from there. So, and I guess I bring that up because I don't see necessarily everybody playing as many practice matches as they could. In fact, some of the players I work with now, they're only going to structured clinic practices. And you're getting some point play there, but as we're talking about these stages of a match, how do you replicate that in a point play situation with 4 kids on the court? Very difficult.
No, I absolutely, and I see the same with players I work with. I think nowadays more and more players are, they're sticking to structured clinics, and maybe they've, I think it's less and less common for players to just call each other up and play practice sets. And I think, many of these situations, whether it be closing out a set, whether it be fighting back from being down a break, or whatever it may be, that ability to think back to those moments where you've done it before successfully, where, maybe you're playing in a tournament and 2 days before you're playing a practice set with your buddy and you were able to close that set out. You served, you had a good service game and you were able to close the set out successfully. So being able to look back at those moments, can really lead to a lot of confidence when you really need it, when you're, a little bit nervous trying to serve the match out or the set out.
Right, exactly. So let's start getting into the different stages of the match. So I think the ones that we're going to talk about today are the beginning of the match and really into the first few games. Kind of treat all that together. Then we're going to talk about having a lead in the set or maybe being down. So you could be up a break or down a break, one of those. And then we'll talk about closing out the first set. Okay. Which I think maybe we can draw some parallels to closing out the match as well. But I think we wanted to stick with the set today because, quite frankly, some of the people who might be listening to this, maybe they're playing round robins and there's only one set.
Yep.
Or we could be thinking about doubles matches where if it's a junior tournament, just to 8. If it's in college, it's just 1 set to 6. So that's really quick. And so we'll try to talk about some of those things as we go along. So Josh, let's start off with the beginning of the match. What's sort of your best advice to help people navigate that stage and overcome some of those initial challenges that we have at the beginning of the match?
Sure. So to me, one of the big things is not just coming into a match blind. So not just coming in and saying, okay, my favorite shot is my forehand or my inside out forehand, and I'm just going to be hitting that shot as much as possible. But trying to think about, your opponent, think about the other side of the net. Maybe this is a player you've played before. Maybe this is a player you've seen or you've heard about, or maybe it's just something that you noticed during the warm-up. So trying to notice those weaknesses, during that warm-up, even if it's just a 5-minute warm-up before the match, making him hit different types of shots, seeing what type of shots trouble him or her. So noticing those weaknesses and then testing them those first few games of the match. So that's the one thing, trying to notice those weaknesses and, test them. Also, I think a big point is not to be too aggressive right off the bat. I often see players, maybe they're aggressive players that like to attack and, before they really find that rhythm in the match, they've, within those first few games, they've maybe made 8 unforced errors. And it's, what's going on? They're trying to go for their shots and they're trying to play their game, but they maybe start a little bit too fast. So I actually suggest that players often start a little bit slower, starting maybe at 70, 80%, having a little bit bigger targets just from the beginning and not trying to make too many unforced errors. And then, once you're a few games in, you've got your feet under you, you can, go to a more aggressive style of play if that's how you like to play. What about you, Brian? With those first few games of the match, which can definitely trip players up. What are some of the things that you try to help players with?
Well, I think first of all is recognizing that, if we're nervous, that's okay. Let's just accept that. And it's actually nerves create some good energy, and it's about, I think it comes from a good place. I think nerves initially are generated because we want to do well. Now that often then transforms into thinking about all the negative outcomes, and that tends to make it worse. But if we understand that we want to do well, then can we channel that focus into what we need to do well? I feel like those first few games, I think there's a fine line between you kind of like what you said about maybe not being aggressive and minimizing errors, because I don't necessarily like to talk about errors because and even though maybe we have to, does that make the player more tentative at the beginning? So I think one of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing, because your advice is about getting that person to establish some rhythm and then they can open up their shots. I think we should be more actively working on how we feel in those first few games. So working on the breathing, working on loosening up our muscles, so that we're not so tight on ground strokes, and that maybe we find that rhythm a little bit faster. I like the idea of hitting to big targets, or maybe you can even hit big to big targets.
Yep.
And maybe in those first couple games you do use some of your favorite shots because you probably feel a little less anxiety hitting some of those things than maybe your not so favorite shot. So I think you establish your game, by focusing on your targets. I like that aspect of things. I think if we can work on how we feel, and I think those first few games, it's a good idea to really set the tone and show the opponent how hard he or she is going to have to work if they want to win this match.
I like that.
Because depending on your level, right? I mean, so if you're, say, in the 12s or the 14s, and you set that tone, you can get a lot of players to just sort of involuntarily raise their hand and say, you know what, I'm not up for this.
Yep.
I'm not ready to work that hard to play this match. And so I feel like we want to make sure that we are setting some tone like that. I love the idea of going through the warm-up and like probing and testing. I think that's great. I think that's actually something we could probably give players. Like, what are those probes and tests, right? Maybe a few high balls to the backhand or the forehand, right? Both sides. Can you hit it low? How do they handle that? Maybe just move them a little bit.
How do they handle the slice?
Yeah.
I think it's a good one.
All those things, right? So, yeah, part of the warm-up is, of course, you getting yourself in a groove, but it's also, all right, what am I getting over here? We also don't want to get lulled into a false sense of security. Just because somebody's missing shots in the warm-up doesn't mean they're going to miss them in the match. I have made that mistake. Feeling, this is not going to be so bad, and then the guy never misses that shot again.
They're a hustler, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you touched on a big point of player focusing on how you feel. Those right in the beginning, and we talked about how it's common for players to be tight or nervous, right from the start. I think it's also helpful to talk to players and have them realize that even the best in the world, even the pros, experience that and talk openly about how they're feeling nervous, feeling tight going into matches. They've been doing this their whole lives. They're making a living at it. They're playing at the highest stages, and they still feel those feelings of nervousness and anxiety. So I think having players recognize that it's a normal feeling, and also the fact that nervousness and excitement really are physiologically very, very similar. Yeah. So being able to shift some of those thoughts from I'm so nervous, I'm so tight. This is going to be tough, which gets into that negative self-talk. To be able to just say, hey, this is normal. I'm a little bit tight, and it's something I'm really excited for. It's a big match, a great opportunity here. So helping players to shift some of those thoughts and to see the match more as an opportunity and something that you're excited about rather than something that you're fearful of, to me is big. But no, I agree. Using that warm up to probe and to test players. I think a few high balls with some heavy spin or some utilizing that slice, seeing how they get low for the ball, seeing if they struggle with that, or making them move one direction or the other. Maybe some high volleys too during the warm up, seeing sure. Just generally seeing what they struggle with and seeing how that can be exploited right off the bat. But sometimes somebody maybe is a little bit lackluster during the warm up, the sort of carelessly miss a few shots, and maybe that won't happen during just the match. So just being aware of what you perceive to be a weakness and seeing if that actually plays out as the match gets started.
Yeah, good point about the pros too, because I think in our first episode you mentioned the Nadal team match. Did you not?
Yep.
I mean, for Rafael Nadal to lose a set 6-0, yeah, I mean Dominic Thiem may have played great, but I think if we were to go back and watch the video of that, it's probably Nadal feeling the nerves
Yep.
of that quarterfinal matchup, right? Similar to, I think, and I may have mentioned this, he lost the first set 6-1 to Roger Federer in one of the French Open finals. And in both matches, what happened? He came back and won both of those. So, it happens to everybody, and it's not the end of the world if we don't get off to a good start, because that's certainly possible. We obviously would want to get off to a good start and get through some of these things and establish our game. So let's maybe talk about the next stage, Josh, and maybe we'll say we didn't get off to a good start. How do we approach that?
Sure. So let's say you're down a break, right? So let's say maybe you go down 3-0 and you're a serve, you're down a break, or maybe it's just a 1-game difference. But if you're down a break, a couple of things that I like to think about are, number one, just trying to be aware of the situation. We talked about who's doing what to who, or why am I down a break right now? Is it based on one service game that I had where maybe there were 2 double faults and I threw away a couple points? Maybe the opponent has just really kept the pressure on me, and I haven't been able to really keep up with that, or match it with my own aggressive play. Maybe all of the games so far have been really competitive, and it's just come down to a couple deuce points here and there. So maybe whether it's certain errors that have been made, I think it's important for a player to evaluate what's going on and to recognize, is it the game plan that's wrong? Is it the game plan that needs to be adjusted, or is it the execution? Am I just do I have the right strategy and game plan going into this? I'm just not executing on my shots. So I think recognizing what's going on and then seeing if maybe the game plan has to be adjusted, or if you just need to execute in a more effective way. But I think also, when you're down, making sure that you keep your chin up and not, obviously easier said than done. I'm not going to pretend that I've always done that, but I think, when players have a negative mindset and they're angry and they're down a break, their chances of coming back are slim. Where if you can stay positive and focus on those things that you can control, like your strategy, like your attitude, then it makes the turnaround possible. So I think I would say, the mindset is really important there. And then also just that awareness of recognizing what's going on in the match and why the score is the way it is.
Yeah.
What about you? If for players?
Well, a lot of what you said there, Josh, made me like, one of the things we could be saying to ourselves is, it's not a big deal.
Yep.
Right? 3, let's say it is 3-0. 3 is not equal to 6. The only thing that is changing throughout a set as the score changes is the probability of who's going to win the set. That sort of that ratio changes. So, the player who has 3 is more likely to win the set, but is not a sure thing, not a guarantee.
There's no way to run out the clock in tennis.
That's right. Although that's coming with some of the newer things that have been happening during the pandemic. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So we're never at 0% chance of coming back. So it's not a big deal. If you can be believing that, and you've probably been down 3-0 before, right? You talked about past experience before in closing out things. You've probably come back from 3-0. And it's just a matter of settling yourself down, realizing what's going on in that match. And there could be a number of ways that we got to 3-0. And I think that sometimes is also part of the journey of getting from 0 to 6, so that you can't replicate in a practice. Like if I were to say, hey, Josh, you and so go out and it's 4-all and just play the set out from 4-all. It somewhat matters how we got to 4-all. So if you were up 4-0 and now it's 4-4, you may be feeling differently than if it were on serve all the way, or if you had been the one to come back, now, of course, as, professionals in this line of business, we're going to try to ask people to not care how they got there, to just go from you are where you are and so forth. But I think the more that we can understand that the set is not over, it's probably not a big deal. And also, let's take that lens, Josh, where we're looking at the other side of the court.
Mm-hmm.
What might the opponent be thinking? Could they be relaxing a little bit here? Could they get a little bit tight? Maybe because they have established a lead. And whether those things are necessarily true or not, they can help fuel us and make us feel better about, maybe increasing our effort level, our intensity level, um, and focusing on, our game plan and getting back to exploiting them.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. That awareness of what somebody on the other side of the net is thinking, and I think part of that just comes from playing more matches because if you have struggled closing out a match and you're on the other side of that and your opponent right now is at 5-3 or 5-4 trying to close that match out, you know that, hey, there's a good chance they're feeling nervous or tight right now because they know that if I'm able to break right now, we're back, back even, we're back on serve. So being able to, flip things in your head and not just think about your own perspective of, oh, okay, I'm down, he or she is closing, serving to close out the match right now, but recognizing, hey, they might be tight, or if they're serving the match out, or if it's 3-0, hey, it's very common for players to take the foot off the gas in that type of situation, right? So maybe this is an opportunity for me to get myself back in this. So I think having that broader awareness of not just yourself, but of the other player and of the match as a whole, and of the ups and downs of the sport and how matches go, where it's very rare for one player to just win 3-0 and then just steamroll the rest of the match. There generally are those back and forth, those up and downs.
Yeah.
So I think being able to put yourself in that other player's shoes is huge.
And I think that's one of the reasons that tennis is so difficult mentally and the famous tennis journalist and broadcaster Bud Collins, he used to refer to tennis as boxing without bloodshed. And it's a one-on-one sport, it's a fight, but it doesn't have the same sort of dire consequences of a physical fight. And I was saying this to an athlete the other day. I said, if you were in an actual fight, let's say, Josh, you and I are boxing, okay, and you throw a punch and you miss, do you stop and then criticize yourself in the middle of the ring?
You're going to be in trouble if you do, yeah.
Yeah, you're going to be in big trouble. But that's exactly what tennis players do. We're fighting this other person, but we're also fighting ourselves at that moment. Can we instead keep the focus, put ourselves in the shoes of the opponent a little bit more, understanding what they may be thinking, and then using that information against them?
No, absolutely. I think that's a great comparison. I think to go back to that, if you're fighting yourself the whole time, if every time you miss a shot you're beating yourself up, or you're throwing your racket, or insulting my backhand is the worst, then there's two opponents out there. There's your opponent on the other side of the net and yourself that you have to deal with. Where if you can get past that and just work diligently on defeating the person on the other side of the net, then you're going to have a much easier time than having to combat yourself at the same exact time.
Yeah. And then some matches it's the person or doubles team that beat themselves up the least that wins. And yeah. So let's talk about being having a lead, up a break. I'll go first this time. So I think if I'm counseling somebody who's up a break, number one, this is a good thing, but you haven't won anything yet. So just because you're up 3-0, again, 3 doesn't equal 6, so let's not pretend that it does. And we got to make sure that we are staying focused on our opponent and continuing to break that person down. We have to. This is where I think having a really good knowledge of the tennis scoring system is important. We are trying to get to 6. So 3 is just getting us there, right? Points and games are a means to an end. The end is getting to 6. We got to realize we haven't won anything yet. We got to keep them uncomfortable. Obviously, whatever we're doing is working. This is not a time to change what we're doing. This is a time for the opponent to figure some things out. Now, I think at certain stages, especially as we get used to playing this stage and maybe we're nervous, is let's slow things down a little bit. Let's bring our focus back to what we want to do. Let's be deliberate in that game. So let's say it's 3-0 and I'm serving, or the player I'm working with is serving. I may counsel them to say, all right, let's slow it down here. Let's stay focused on what's been working. Go through your routine. Make sure you've got a plan for every point. Because what often happens after a break, you know this, Josh, is that the player gets broken back. They might be a little bit too happy or relaxed with what just happened by getting that break. So I think this is a good moment to reset, settle things down, and let's play a good, focused, deliberate game so that we can consolidate that break and then go up. When we talked about loss aversion before, I think this is what can happen, is that if I'm up 3-0 or 4-1, the majority of my thoughts are going to avoiding 4-2 more so than wanting to get to 5-1. And it's not that 100% of my thoughts are on protecting the lead, but enough of them could be on that where I tighten up and start to lose focus on what I'm trying to do. And so we've got to realize that is a part of what happens in human beings. It's a natural thing that we do, is we are always looking for the negative aspect of things and what we have to lose. But in tennis, this is not a life and death situation. We've got to realize, okay, that thought exists, but the goal here is not to avoid 4-2. The goal is to get to 5-1. So what are your thoughts on helping players when they're up a break?
Yeah, I like the point that you made about rather than trying to protect against or being fearful of going from 4-1 to 4-2, thinking about the possibility or that opportunity of getting to 5-1, but also knowing that, likely the opponent's not just going to hand that to you. You're going to have to, play at a high level, which oftentimes comes from, sticking with the type of game plan or the type of play that got you to that point. Recognizing why the score is the way that it is, which, really comes from awareness of the match and what's been happening, and sticking with, a particular game plan or a particular shot that's really been working. Maybe it's that inside-out forehand where you're using your strength to really, move the opponent around and break down their weakness. So I think that is really important, recognizing what's going on and sticking to whatever's been working. I think it's also critical that players keep the pressure on. I like to think of it as keeping the foot on the gas. We talked about how common it is for players to go from, a 3-0 or being, ahead in a match to just giving it back. When you break, you're most likely to be broken back right away. Yeah. Because I think oftentimes players get a little bit too comfortable, and rather than really thinking about, okay, this is what I have to do right now. What's important now? They'll just, they almost take it for granted. That, okay, I broke now. Okay, it's going to be, I've got this under control. And as soon as you think that, you let up a bit, and everything becomes a lot more difficult because your opponent comes roaring back. So, keeping the pressure on is definitely important. Then also, we talked about how important it is to see things from your opponent's perspective, right? So if you're up, you better realize that, hey, your opponent's not, most of the time, not just going to be, taking this lightly. They're going to be fighting back. So they may be changing up their strategy. They may be making adjustments. So you need to be ready for that. You need to be aware enough to recognize if they're making certain adjustments. Because if they're making changes to their game, you're going to have to adjust to counter whatever they're doing. Maybe they're coming to the net a lot because they think that that's a great adjustment that they can make. Or, maybe they're serving bigger. Whatever's going on, you might need to make adjustments to counter the changes that they're making in their game. Because if they say, okay, I'm down 3-0, if I keep doing what I'm doing, it's going to be 6-0, then they're likely to change up what they're doing. So I think being aware of those changes and being ready to adapt to whatever the opponent throws at you.
And I think what you were just saying there really prompted a thought about the dynamic between the two players, right? So, for example, Josh, how many times have you come across maybe a parent who says, my kid is really good at coming back from being down 5-1 or 5-2
All the time.
all the time. And I listen to these things and it's like, they're giving 100% credit to their child,
Yep.
for overcoming that deficit. But we both know, and it's just what we were talking about, right, with loss aversion. You've got one player who's up 5-2, who is thinking about what he has to lose or she has to lose. And the other player has nothing to lose. So they start to be more free with their body. They let their shots go. And all of a sudden, those dynamics, they interlock there and they create a comeback for the player who was down. And I think the more that we as players understand these dynamics, more awareness we have about that, the better we can handle them when we're in those moments.
Yep.
So we've now reached the end of the set. Somebody's going to close it out here, or maybe we're in a tiebreaker, but we'll say somebody's going to close out this set. What are some things that you have players focus on and think about as they get into this? And maybe also if it's different for doubles, talk about that.
Yeah, well, definitely is different for doubles. We talked about how doubles can be a lot shorter, where rather than playing 2 out of 3, you're playing an 8-game pro set, or maybe even just a set in college. But I think what's important generally is at the end of a set to a couple things to evaluate what happened this past set, and then really, especially if you're on the losing side of it, to be able to reset and put it behind you. If you're starting off the next set still thinking about or still upset about something that happened 15 minutes ago, maybe you were on serve and then you got you played a sort of a sloppy service game and you got broken, and then your opponent was able to just keep their serve and you lost the set, and you're still thinking back to that service game. Oh, why did I go for such a big second serve on break point? I double faulted, threw that away. So if you're still thinking about that as the next set starts, you're gonna be in trouble. So being able to reset, sometimes honestly, as simple as just going to the bathroom, as simple as walking away from the court for a couple minutes, going to the bathroom, reset. Sometimes some players like to put on a new shirt, new pair of socks, even something that symbolically says to yourself that it's a new situation where you can move on. I think is huge. Sometimes it's that little something symbolic that you need. Sometimes, it's a little bit of breathing where you can, maintain control of the present moment rather than constantly looking back. So I think, being aware of what happened, but especially if you're on the losing side of things, being able to put it behind you. Where alternatively, if you're on the winning side, really, keeping that foot on the gas, really focusing on the start of the next set, making sure that you get out, really trying to get off to a strong start, because knowing that if you won that first set and you can get off to a strong start in the next set, number one, your opponent could just fold.
Yeah.
And number two, it's going to position you a lot better. So really, focusing on coming out with a lot of intensity to start that next set.
Yeah, I agree. I think that beginning of the second set or the next set, whichever second or third, is one of the critical moments of a match.
Yep.
And I think in both situations, whether you've won the first set or lost the first set, those first few games of the second set could really be used to break your opponent mentally. So if you won it and you get off to a great start, maybe they tap out. If you lost it and you get off to a great start, now your opponent may be thinking, oh, why is she playing better now? Now I'm going to have to play a third set. Then you start to create some of these negative thoughts in your opponent. So really there's an opportunity to break your opponent either way. But I think the the idea here is you've got to come out with a lot of energy and intensity and motivation and realize you're not out of it. One set is nothing. We just talked about Nadal losing sets 6-0 and 6-1, but coming back to win matches. Sometimes the hardest sets to lose are the close ones, but that just shows you how close you are.
Absolutely. No, I think, and again, that's why it's so important to be able to put, let's say you lost that set in a tiebreak, 7-6, or it was, 7-5 and you got broken, 5-all, or whatever it may be, being able to put it behind you. I also really liked what you said about a little bit earlier as the start of the match, and I think this applies the same towards the start of the second set, to how you play those first few games really sends a message to your opponent.
Yeah.
So, if let's say you lost that first set in a close way, 6-4, 7-5, 7-6, but you come out firing the beginning of this next set, your opponent's going to say, hey, I know I won that first set, but this is going to be a tough battle. They're coming out hot, they're coming out firing. They're not just going to give this to me. I really need to buckle down. It's going to be quite a fight. So I think you're right that you're really right in the beginning, you want to be sending that message, and those first few games can really swing a match either way. But also, if it's not going your way, having the broad enough perspective to recognize that the match isn't over just because I get off to a slow start in the second set or the third set or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think if we have won the first set, one attitude that we want to have is we've got to expect the opponent to play better.
Yep.
And so that maybe gets back to that relaxation piece is, all right, we've won one set. We haven't won the match yet. We haven't won anything. We just won one set. If I expect that player to play better, then I'm more prepared if he or she does.
Right. You're not
going to. If I'm not expecting that, then I can get surprised.
Yep. If you're expecting them to play better, you're expecting it to be tough. You're not going to take your foot off the gas and let up on your intensity. You're expecting them to make more shots or maybe change up their game plan to something more effective, and it reminds you that you need to keep up a high level of tennis to give yourself a best chance, rather than just saying, okay, I won this first set. This has been fun, but I've got this match. But it's where you start taking things for granted. But it reminds you never to take a match or even a single point for granted, because you're expecting them to come in ready to fight.
Yeah, let's go back one stage and just talk about that like closing out piece. So let's say, Josh, you're even in your college coaching capacity, you've got a player. It's 5-4. He or she is going to serve. What's the conversation like before that game?
Yeah, I find from my experiences, this is a challenging moment, both from my own playing experiences and as well as with players that I've coached, because I think oftentimes players will start thinking about the score and start thinking about the outcome and think, okay, it's 5-2 or it's 5-4. I just need to serve out this game and then I've got the set, or then I've got the match. The match is over. So I think helping players to shift that focus from the outcome into the process, into things that they can do that will give them the best possible chance. So if they're serving, maybe they need to take something off the serve and make more first serves. Maybe they, if they've identified a certain weakness, maybe the opponent's backhand return, they need to make sure that opponent is hitting as many backhand returns as possible. So focusing on a certain strategy or game plan is huge. I think also reminding players to breathe, reminding players to stick to routines, because you recognize that they will be feeling more anxiety, more pressure during those moments. So, reminding them to use their routines and to breathe is huge. And then I think also, reminding them, and, sometimes it's during the changeover, sometimes maybe it's even between points. Hey, 1 point at a time. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't get ahead of yourself thinking, okay, it's 15-love. I'm 3 points ahead of, 3 points away from winning. No, we're going to focus on this point. What do we need to do this point? Where are we serving here? Where are we trying to return here? Another thing that I have found successful is actually flipping the score in your head. Some players, maybe, Brian, you mentioned, parents saying that their child plays better when they're coming from behind, which, I often find to be the case too. So, many athletes I find do play better in those situations. So if they're in a situation where they have to close out a set or close out a match, if you can flip the score and say, hey, it's not 5-4, it's actually 4-5 right now. And, this is really an important game here to stay in this match. Or even it's not 40-love where it's match point, it's love 40, or it's, 30-40 where this is an important point here. But being able to sort of trick yourself can actually, I find, release a lot of that tension and anxiety, because you're not thinking that this one point or this one game is so important to finishing out the match.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that may work for a lot of players.
I think generally for athletes, not thinking too much about the score, focusing on that process, things within their control is more important. But if that's not possible, then actually almost lying to yourself and flipping that score in your head can be a really effective strategy. Yeah. What about you when you've been, within college tennis or in your own experiences, serving out a match or working with a player who's got to serve out a match, serve out a set? What is that conversation like? What are some of the main points that you try to instill on that player?
I think much of it is the same as what you said. I might use some different language. I might be talking about, let's be deliberate.
Yep.
In this here, but I think it's the same thing. We're going one point at a time. We have a plan for every point. We understand how we got here. But I think, when we're working with a team or an athlete over the course of months or years, one of the things that I try to develop with them is a sense of their identity as a good tennis player. And part of that identity might be around closing. So I might say, if I'm coaching you, Josh, I might be like, all right, Josh, you're a closer. This is just what you do. That's just part of who you are. You know how to do this, right? And we would have worked on that mentality and that identity, throughout the season, so that, when you get in this situation, it's not about, oh, what should I do? It's more about, this is what I do because that's who I am. I'm a closer.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that? I know that, you like James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. He talks a lot about identity.
It's true. No, I think, whatever you identify as, or however you identify, you will pull on that identity in those key moments. When it's, when you're serving for that match, you will remember all those conversations that you've had, about how that's part of who you are, how, closing is an important part of who I am. I've been doing this all season, been in the college situation, or if you're in a USTA team, you can think back to those previous matches where you've been able to close successfully. But I agree. I think, from a sports psychology perspective, building that identity and, developing that identity over a period of time is so important that, once you're in that situation, you're less likely to tighten up. And because, you've been there before, and that's who you are. And I say less likely because, I think we'll say it again and again, many of these things are easier said than done. We see even the best in the world do tighten up at times, do, struggle in some of those big moments at times. It does happen. It's never, it's not like some of these things are fixed and you're never going to have to encounter them again. But the idea with sports psychology or mental skills training is that you're less likely to succumb to some of these feelings through establishing that identity as a closer, as somebody who, is able to maintain their style and their level of tennis even through those biggest moments in a match.
And I think once you have an identity, you can also begin then to understand what the process or your systems are to, support that identity.
Yep.
And once you understand, this is how I play effective tennis, then that's all I really need to do. It's not going to guarantee you wins, but it's going to give you a chance.
Right.
Because what do we see happen when people have mental challenges? They lose track of their process, or they have no process. Yep. They have no system at all. when if we can be helping them understand what their process and their system is and just say, all right, okay, yeah, you're in that situation. Let's go back to what you do best, understanding the situation, following your routines, working on your body language, your self-talk, and going to all those things and having them practice that. So it really becomes more part of who they are, their tennis DNA, their tennis identity. I think then it becomes easier to manage these situations because you have now built some experience into that. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, no, absolutely. I think as that identity becomes established, and you're able to successfully perform in those moments over the course of time, it becomes easier and easier. And maybe there are moments in time where you do have chances to close out a match and you get broken, and then whatever, maybe you win or end up losing on that particular day, but it's still part of your identity, part of who you are, and you've built certain processes, as you said, where that help you to achieve that goal of being a good closer. So maybe you found that when you're serving out that set at 5-4, if you can increase a little bit of pressure through serving and volleying a couple times in that game, that is an effective way to be even more successful in that service game. Maybe if you're returning, at 5-4 or in a tie break, and you find that, maybe you find you get a little bit tighter during some of those moments, so that you find that rather than going for a big return, you're going to go to the chip, and that just increases your chances, and gives you the best possible chance for success. So I think that, you're right. Through those experiences, you figure out the pieces to the puzzle for that identity. So if your identity is as a closer, you figure out the best method to close it over time, over experience. And I think that's also, going back to something we were talking about before, playing those practice sets, right? So if the only time you're competing is when it really counts, when you're playing for your UTR, or when you're playing for your team or your university or high school or whatever it may be, the only time you're competing are in those moments, then you don't have as much to draw from. But if you're competing multiple times a week outside of those situations, then you have so many more data points to really draw from. So I totally agree. I think that's a skill that's built over time. And I think the more that you get out there and compete, and sometimes you'll be successful and sometimes you won't be successful.
That's right.
But it's just more that it's built up.
And I think, let's say I'm playing that 5-4 game and I follow my systems and my process, to a T, and I lose that game.
Yep.
I can feel okay about that because I did what I could, to win that game, as opposed to the 5-4 situation where I got away from, my best process and I didn't do my routines, and I'm going to be much more upset about that because I basically gave control away of like the things that I do, my routines and my habits on the court. So I think as players begin to develop their mental skills and their mental toughness, this idea of knowing their own systems and process or developing those, which should be inclusive of routines and rituals on the court, off the court, changeovers, etc. Once that's more established, then you have like a foundation that you can build on and become an even better or more mentally tough player, in my opinion.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. I think, over time, those get established. I think, it's very rare for a player who's maybe just starting out playing tournaments to have that clear identity because they just really don't have the experience. But I think over time, you have a clear sense of who you are and what you do well and what helps you to close out those matches or to be strong in those types of situations.
So Josh, great discussion, and we'll have more discussions like this on future episodes. We'll touch on. I think we decided we'll tackle maybe tiebreakers and the 10-point tiebreaker in a separate episode. We'll look at some more specific doubles mental approaches
Yep.
in its own specific episode. Maybe talking about third sets as well. I think this is a good opportunity, for those of you who are listening or watching. If you have some questions about what Josh and I just talked about, or want us to address other situations that we didn't talk about or other stages, send us an email at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. So that's it for today's episode. So, Josh, thank you again. As a reminder for everyone listening or watching, please subscribe to the podcast on your platform of choice. You can also watch all these episodes on YouTube. Like I said, send us an email with questions or suggestions at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Or similarly, you can use the hashtag tennisiq on Twitter. We look forward to seeing you all in our next episode.